Forgotten for centuries, the last Orc queen awoke to find everything changed. She did not wake the way living things wake, gradually, reluctantly, reaching toward warmth. She came back the way stone cracks, all at once, with a sound no one nearby could survive. The chamber had been sealed for 412 years. The humans who found it had spent 11 months drilling, 3 months arguing about who owned the mineral rights, and exactly 47 seconds deciding whether to open it. The decision was made by a junior survey technician named Priya Vasquez, who thought the hatch mechanism looked like a pressure valve, and on instinct, gave it a counterclockwise turn. The blast of atmosphere that came through the breach knocked Priya and her team back 30 feet. 2 of them broke ribs. Priya herself hit the far wall of the tunnel and sat there blinking, ears ringing, while something very old exhaled into the modern world for the first time since the Treaty of the Grell Ascendancy. She watched the dust settle. Then she watched the thing inside the chamber rise. Her name in the old tongue translated roughly to "she who divides the breath of battle." Her people had called her Marath. The Grell Dominion, the alien empire that had locked her away, had called her the Insurgent Queen. In the records that survived, and very few did, the human historians of a pre-contact age who'd found incomprehensible carvings in certain mountain ranges had translated her title as the Orc Queen, a phrase that fit nothing precisely, but stuck in the way bad names always do. Marath stood 7 feet, 2 inches tall. Her skin was the gray-green of deep ocean water before a storm, ridged along the jaw and forearms with bony crests that had evolved over millennia as both armor and signal. They flushed darker when she was angry, pale silver when she was afraid, and a deep arterial crimson when she was about to kill something. Right now they were the indeterminate gray of a person waking from anesthesia. She looked at Priya. Priya looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Marath spoke in a language that had not been used in 4 centuries, a language of ground glass consonants and tonal vowels that vibrated in Priya's chest like a tuning fork held to bone. The meaning of it was, "What day is it? Who holds the ascendancy throne? Bring me my general." Priya, who spoke Hindi, Urdu, English, and conversational Mandarin, said, "I'm sorry, I don't understand you." Marath looked at the woman's clothing. She looked at the device on Priya's wrist that appeared to be a timepiece of some kind, though it glowed in ways no timepiece had any right to. She looked at the drill marks on the stone where her chamber door had been. She looked at the lights mounted in the ceiling, electric, humming faintly, buzzing with a frequency she'd never encountered. She breathed in the recycled air and tasted the chemical ghost of 10,000 human hours of labor. Then she looked back at Priya and said, still in the old tongue, "How long?" It was not a question exactly. It was the sound of someone who already knows the answer and is asking another person to confirm it so that the weight of the knowing can be shared. Priya, who could not have understood the words, understood the tone perfectly. She held up her wrist and pointed at the display on her watch. Marath stared at the numerals. She knew numbers. Numbers were the one universal. She read the year. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she sat down on the floor of the chamber, in the rubble of her 400-year sleep, and put her face in her hands. They gave her a room in the survey company's underground facility, which was not designed for someone her height, and so required the removal of every light fixture below 7 feet. They gave her a translation interface that had been adapted, with impressive speed, from a xenolinguistic database compiled during the first 30 years of the Grell contact. The database was built for Grell Dominion dialects, and her language was not a Grell dialect, but the bones of it were similar enough. The Grell had absorbed so many species into their empire that their trade tongue was a palimpsest of 100 conquered languages. Hers was one of the original layers. Communication was labored. It happened in fragments, with long silences that were not awkward so much as tectonic, as though entire continents of meaning were shifting beneath the surface of each exchanged sentence. Her first coherent question, rendered through the interface, was, "Where is the Dominion now?" The linguist assigned to her, a nervous young man named Dr. Aidan Rourke, had prepared for this. He had printouts. He had a tablet loaded with summary documents. He had spent 6 hours deciding how to phrase the answer and had arrived, at midnight, at the conclusion that there was no kind phrasing for it, and that kindness was probably not what she needed anyway. "The Grell Dominion collapsed 190 years ago," he said. "What remains of Grell space is now divided between 3 successor factions, none of which holds what they held at the height of the ascendancy. Earth is sovereign. We have been sovereign for 140 years. He paused. "The general you asked for on the day you woke, we found references to him in the historical record. His name was Vareth of the Stoneblood clan. He died approximately 400 years ago, in battle. The records we have suggest he fought until the end. Mareth was still for a long time after that. Her crest had gone pale silver. "Show me," she said finally, and pointed at the tablet in his hands, and he gave it to her, and she spent the next 16 hours reading everything they had. What the records told her was this. She had been winning. The war, which had no single name because every species involved had called it something different, had been burning for 60 years when Mareth took command of the insurgent coalition. She had spent the previous 20 years as a warlord engineer, which in her culture meant not merely someone who won battles, but someone who understood why battles could be won, who drew the topographic equations of violence with the same rigor that others drew blueprints. She had looked at the Grell Dominion and seen, beneath its vast and terrible surface, its architecture. She had found the weight-bearing walls of their power and spent decades calculating exactly where to strike. And then she had struck. For 8 years the Dominion had bled. Coalition forces had driven them back from 17 contested systems. The insurgency had liberated 6 species held in indentured technological servitude. Mareth herself had personally led 3 campaigns that military historians, the ones who'd later found those incomprehensible carvings, would have recognized as masterworks of asymmetric warfare if they'd had any idea what they were looking at. The Grell had responded the only way a civilization responds when it cannot win militarily. They had cheated. A diplomatic envoy, a ceasefire negotiation. The terms were insulting, so insulting that Mareth had known immediately they were designed to be refused, designed to fracture the coalition along its most fragile seams, to make some of her allies wonder if perhaps the Grell's real anger was at her and not at them. And they had worked, those insulting terms, well enough to slow the insurgency while the Dominion repositioned. Then the second envoy had come, this one with a different offer. The offer had been for Mareth herself. "Surrender yourself," said the Grell, "and we will pause the war for a generation. We will give your people time. You are the weapon," they had said, "and we cannot accept the ceasefire while the weapon is armed. Let yourself be locked away. Sleep in your stone room. Give your people their generation of peace." She had taken 3 days to decide. She had argued with Vareth for all 3 of those days, in the particular way that old friends argue when one of them is about to do something irreversible. He had raged at her. He had laid out, with devastating precision, every reason the Grell would not honor the agreement. He had told her she was making the choice from guilt and not from strategy, that she was tired of the weight of the war, that the leadership of it had cost her something she was not able to name, and she was using this offer as permission to set it down. She had listened to all of it. Then she had walked into the chamber and let them lock the door. He had been right about the Grell, she now read. They had not honored the pause for a generation. They had honored it for 11 years before they resumed the campaigns, by which point the coalition had fragmented, and Vareth had spent the remainder of his life trying to hold it together, which he had done, but differently without her, with the strategies available to a general rather than a warlord engineer. He had won some. He had lost more. He had died in a battle that the historical record described, with the terseness that facts applied to catastrophe, as decisive Grell victory, coordinates, and then a set of numbers that meant nothing to her now. The Dominion had lasted another 200 years after that. Then it had collapsed under the accumulated weight of its own contradictions. The same debt, the same overextension, the same architectural failure she had identified 60 years before it happened. It had just taken 2 more centuries without her to finish the job. She thought about that for a long time. She was still thinking about it when Dr. Rourke came back in the morning with coffee. He'd brought specifically because he'd read somewhere that it was a comfort ritual for humans in grief, and he hadn't known what else to bring, and found her standing at the window of her room watching the dawn. "The universe doesn't move toward chaos," she said through the interface, still looking at the light. "It moves toward order. That's what people get wrong. They think entropy is chaos. But entropy is settling, things finding their lowest state. I could have told them that. I calculated it out. The Dominion would have collapsed. My only mistake was thinking we needed to accelerate it." Rourke held out the coffee. She looked at it. She took it cautiously and looked at it for a while before she drank it, which she did with the expression of someone receiving unexpected news. "That's not unpleasant," she said. "It's a Colombian medium roast," he said. "It's been a universal comfort thing for about 400 years. She looked at him then, and something in her face shifted, and it wasn't funny exactly, and it wasn't tragic, but it was both at once, the way things are when they are very old. 400 years, she said. Yes. I expect that would be long enough. The problem with waking up after 400 years, not the largest problem, but one of the immediate ones, was that everything had rules she hadn't agreed to. Earth was sovereign, which meant Earth's governments had jurisdiction over everything that fell from the sky, everything that came up from the ground, and everything found sealed in old chambers under survey company drill sites. Which meant Marath was, legally, either an alien national of an extinct state, an archaeological artifact, or a refugee, and there were 3 different agencies that each believed firmly she was their problem. She was assigned a legal representative, a woman named Constance Park, who was calm and precise in the way of people who had learned very early that the only useful response to confusion was patience. Constance had represented xenobiological entities in hearings before. She had never represented an entity of this particular classification. The form she filed listed Marath as sovereign head of state, displaced, nation-state extant. No, but she worked with what she had. Here's the simplest version, Constance told her, in the small conference room they'd been given, with the interface between them translating steadily. You can't be held against your will. You haven't committed any crime under current law, but your legal status needs to be established before you can move freely. That takes hearings. The hearings will take time. In the meantime, you stay here. I stayed somewhere against my will for 400 years, Marath said. I find I have very little patience left for the concept. I know, I'm sorry. I'm working as fast as I can. Marath looked at her. The crests along her jaw ran through 3 colors in quick succession and settled back to neutral. You are, she said with some surprise. I can see that. I'm good at my job, Constance said without inflection, which was its own kind of emphasis. Yes, said Marath, I can see that too. The hearing took 6 weeks. It produced, at the end of those 6 weeks, a classification that had been invented specifically for Marath, had no precedent, and would go on to be cited in 47 subsequent cases involving entities of unusual historical status. Sovereign in exile, recognized, with full rights of personhood and free movement under Earth jurisdiction. On the day the classification came through, Constance brought champagne, which she said was a human ritual for moments of difficult victory. Marath drank it with the same expression she'd had about the coffee, receiving unexpected news, and then said, "You put the bubbles in deliberately." "We do, yes." "Interesting," said Marath and finished the glass. She spent the first year learning. She was not passive about it. Marath did not have a passive mode exactly. She had a dormant mode, which was different, and she had just spent 400 years in it and had no interest in revisiting it. Learning was something she did the way she did everything, with the full application of her attention, which was an uncomfortable experience for whatever it was aimed at. She learned the languages first. She had the old forms of Grell trade tongue as a base, and from that scaffold she built 3 of Earth's major languages in under 4 months, which Dr. Rourke, who had been assigned as her primary liaison because no one else volunteered and he was too junior to refuse, found equal parts terrifying and wonderful. She learned the history, all of it. The parts that had happened while she slept, the centuries she had missed, the wars and the treaties and the slow accumulation of consequence that had brought things to their present shape. She read voraciously, with the particular hunger of someone who has been deprived of information, not because they lacked the capacity to absorb it, but because they were not there. She asked questions. She asked them in the methodical way of an engineer checking load-bearing calculations, not out of curiosity exactly, but out of a professional need to understand structure. Why had this alliance held when that one failed? What was the actual mechanism by which the Grell successor factions had stabilized? What did humans use instead of the bonded labor systems that had underpinned the Dominion economy? When told about money, the abstract human mechanism of exchanged value, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "So you build the system of obligation into the currency itself rather than into the person. Interesting, more durable, less efficient to enforce but much harder to overthrow." A pause. "We should have done that." Rourke had started keeping notes. She learned the politics. Earth's relationships with the Grell successor states were complex and layered and built, like all political structures, on foundations that looked like logic but were actually fear wearing logic's clothes. She understood fear-shaped politics. She had spent 60 years fighting one. "The Veth remnant," she said one afternoon, pointing at a star map, "has been pushing into the corridor for 3 years and Earth has responded each time with a diplomatic note. Why?" "There are economic ties," Rourke said. "The Veth supply 2 materials that are. That could be sourced elsewhere. I've read the trade analysis. The supply chain problem is solvable." She traced the boundary lines on the map with one long finger. "This is not an economic decision. This is a habit of deference that was built during a time when deference was the only available strategy, and no one has updated the assessment. Earth is stronger now than when these habits were formed. You are allowing old calculations to govern new conditions." Rourke looked at his notes. "I'll put that in my report," he said. "No," she said, "I'll tell them myself." She began consulting. It started informally, a meeting here, a conversation there, people who had heard about the warlord engineer from the insurgency records and wanted to know what she thought about a particular geopolitical problem, in the same spirit that someone might consult a very old book. They expected history. They got something else. What they got was a person who had spent 60 years at war and 400 years thinking about it, who had no investment in the current political arrangements because she'd been asleep when they were made, and who had a tolerance for blunt assessment that the diplomatic community found alternately refreshing and terrifying. You are managing a deterrence relationship with the Veth remnant based on the assumption that economic interdependence prevents military action, she told a room full of people who controlled things in a building with very good views of the Geneva skyline. This assumption has been correct for 40 years. The Veth leadership has changed 3 times in 40 years. The new administration does not share the previous administration's assessment of the costs. You have not updated your model. You have a window of approximately 18 months before this miscalculation becomes expensive. The room was quiet. "How do you know that?" someone asked. "Because I've watched an empire that was winning lose everything because it failed to update its model," she said. "I am the cautionary exhibit. I would prefer not to watch it happen twice." The window closed at 16 months. The situation resolved without open conflict, because by that point her analysis had been worked into 3 separate policy frameworks, and the interdependence problem had been quietly addressed. Mareth noted the resolution without particular satisfaction. Correct predictions weren't victories. They were just measurements. What she felt underneath the work was harder to name. She had a habit in the evenings of recording messages. Not to anyone, there was no one to record them to. Vareth was 400 years gone. The coalition was dust. The names she knew were all in archives, referenced in the past tense, their crests described in historical documents that got the colors half wrong. She recorded the messages because she had learned the habit from the film she'd watched during the long months of establishing her legal status. A strange, quiet film that someone on Rourke's team had thought she might find interesting, about a man who shared his life with his other self through recorded videos, who came home every day to a message waiting for him, who knew everything about someone he'd never been in the room with. She had watched it 3 times. The part that stayed with her was the rules. The 2 of them had made rules, the 2 selves, a list of obligations and privacies designed to make a shared life livable. She had written rules like that once. Not with another self, but with a general who had argued with her for 3 days about whether she was throwing herself away, and with whom she had finally arrived, through exhaustion and honesty, at something like an agreement. That she would go into the chamber, and that he would go on without her, and that this was not an ending but a strategy, even if it felt like one. He had honored the agreement. He had gone on. He had fought without her for 4 centuries. He had done what could be done. She recorded her messages to him, though he was gone. She described her days, the strange coffee, the sparkling wine, the humans with their intricate habits of comfort, the politics she was learning to navigate, the slow, astonishing accumulation of a world she had not been there to build. She told him what she'd found. She told him what she missed. She told him that the universe moved toward order, that the Dominion had collapsed on schedule, that his death had not been for nothing, that the math had worked out, that she wished he had been here to see it. She told him once that she was glad she'd gone into the chamber. She looked at the recording for a long time after she'd made it. Then she kept it. She did not delete it, even though there was no one to receive it, because some messages are for the sender. The crisis, when it came, was not one she had predicted. She had made herself useful enough that she had access to things, rooms, briefings, the texture of Earth's strategic deliberations, that few people not born on this planet had ever seen. She had made herself useful in the specific way of someone who understands that usefulness is the only currency available to the recently arrived, and who therefore deploys it without ego, takes the less interesting assignments without complaint, builds reputation through consistency rather than display. It was Dr. Rourke who brought her the file. He came in the evening, which was unusual, and he looked like someone carrying something heavy in his chest. "There's a situation," he said, "and someone very senior decided about an hour ago that you should be briefed." The file was about the Grell's successor state called the Veth Remnant, which she had warned them about 18 months ago and which they had, mostly, managed. But the Veth Remnant was not the problem. The problem was what the Veth had found in the process of pushing into the corridor, a sealed installation, very old, deep in an asteroid belt on the contested boundary. The installation was of Grell Ascendancy vintage. It had been a research site of some kind. The Veth had opened it and found inside a technology. The technology was called, in the original Grell, the Erasure Engine. In the records that described it, and there were records, terrible records, which was why the file she was reading was rated at a classification level, she did not technically possess but which someone had decided to override. The erasure engine had been used exactly once, 280 years ago, in the final campaign against a coalition remnant that refused to surrender. It had not killed anyone. It had done something, in the assessment of the historians who'd studied it later, that was considered worse. It had removed the contested star system from the navigational record of every ship in the area, had altered the resonance signature of the location so that no instrument could find it, had hidden 3 inhabited worlds and their 4 billion people behind a wall of navigational impossibility. Those 3 worlds had never been found again. The Veth had not yet activated the installation. They were studying it. But the Veth's new leadership had been making the kind of statements that preceded the kind of decisions that resulted in files rated above anyone's technical clearance. Mareth read the file twice. Then she set it down and was quiet for a long time. "You're going to ask me if I know how to stop it," she said. "We're going to ask you if you know anything that isn't in the records," Rourke said. "I know more than what's in the records," she said. "I fought them for 60 years. I know the architecture." She paused. "I know where the weight-bearing walls are." He waited. "The engine requires a localization anchor," she said. "It can hide a location, but only if it has a fixed reference point, a resonance pin that the engine uses to define the space it's erasing. Without the pin, it can't define the boundary of what it's removing. It would just erase itself, collapse inward." She looked at the star map. "The pin is always installed separately from the engine. Standard Grell security protocol split the key from the lock. They would have put it somewhere they considered safe, somewhere with a long operational history, somewhere." She stopped. Rourke watched her face. "Somewhere they didn't think anyone would ever look," she said slowly, "because they'd already looked and found it unremarkable." She put her finger on the map, not on the asteroid belt, somewhere else. "Here, there's a survey station in this system. Human-operated, been there for 60 years, but it was a Grell relay before that, before the Dominion fell. It would have been in continuous operation for 300 years, Rourke said, reading from another file. "They hid the pin in the noise of a functioning installation. Standard practice. You leave a thing running long enough, no one checks what it's running for." She looked at him. "If the Veth activate the engine without the pin, they destroy themselves and the installation. If they find the pin first." "We need to move faster than they do," he said. "Yes." What happened next was not cinematic, which she knew even as it was happening, because she had been in enough actual war to understand that the cinematic parts were the exceptions and the ordinary parts. The planning, the logistics, the careful accumulation of correct decisions made under bad information were the bulk of the thing. She spent 4 days in a room with people who controlled things, making calculations. She rebuilt the architecture of an extinct empire's security protocols from memory, and from the fragments in the records, and from the deep structural logic of how things were built by people who trusted no one, including themselves. She argued. She listened. She corrected, more than once, the assessment of experts who knew more about the current Grell successor states than she did, but less about the original engineering. She was not the one who retrieved the pin. That was a team. She did not go with them because her legal status was sovereign in exile recognized, and sovereign in exile recognized did not extend to covert operations in contested space. A limitation Constance had flagged with the precision of someone who saw legal problems before they became legal problems. What she gave the team was the location, the recognition protocol, the exact method of extraction, and a particular piece of advice she'd given only once before in her life, to a different team in a different war. The Grell engineers built everything to last. Don't try to break it. Just convince it that its purpose is complete. The team came back with the pin. The Veth activated the engine 3 months later. It erased approximately half of their own installation before it collapsed. No one died, which she considered an acceptable outcome, because the goal was never to cause damage but to prevent it, and people who understood the difference between those two objectives were, in her assessment, the only kind worth working with. There was a dinner. She had been to dinners before, in the year and a half since her waking, but this one was different in the way that certain dinners are different. Not because of the food, which she had by now developed specific opinions about, but because of the quality of the silence in the room, which was the silence of people who had been relieved of a fear they hadn't quite acknowledged having. She sat at the long table and watched the humans around her, Rourke, who had brought her coffee on the first morning, Constance, who had invented a new legal classification without breaking stride, the senior people with their good views of the Geneva skyline, the team that had gone into contested space and come back, and she felt something she did not have a ready word for in any of the languages she had learned. The closest word in the old tongue, translated as the particular warmth that comes from being in a room with people who have chosen to be accountable to each other. She recorded a message that night, the longest one. She told Vareth about the dinner. She described Rourke's face when the pin came back, the way he had laughed with his whole body, the way humans laughed, which was still surprising to her, this full-body commitment to a momentary joy. She described Constance, who had raised her glass and said to unprecedented legal categories, with the exact tone of someone who found their own precision funny. She described the food. There had been something with pasta that she needed to investigate further, and the sparkling wine, and the skyline through the window. She told him that the world was different than it had been, that some things were better, and some things were worse, and most things were simply different in ways that didn't fit on a scale of better or worse. That humans were strange and specific, and full of small rituals of comfort that made the weight of things more bearable. That she had been wrong to think that going into the chamber was the right decision, and also that she had been right, and that both of these things were true, which was something she hadn't understood at 60, but understood now. She told him that she had been a weapon once, that she did not think she was a weapon anymore, that she wasn't sure what she was exactly in this new configuration, this new world, but that she was beginning to think that not knowing was not the same as being lost. Then she was quiet for a while, and she looked at the recording and she said, "I wish you were here." She meant it the way she had always meant it, not as grief exactly, or not only as grief, but as the honest statement of a fact that deserved to be stated, because the universe moved toward order, and order required the accounting of real things, and this was a real thing. She wished he were here. She would always wish he were here. That wish was its own kind of continuity, a thread across 400 years that did not break because the person at the other end was gone, any more than a star's light stopped existing because the star was gone. She kept the recording. In the spring, they called it spring because it was when the northern hemisphere tilted toward warmth, which she had found, to her own surprise, that she looked forward to. She took a walk. This was not a remarkable thing. She had been taking walks for months, through the city that had been built in the years she'd slept, with its impossible density of human intention, every surface a record of someone's decision about what something should look like. She walked without anyone escorting her now. That had required some adjustments at the beginning, on the city's part and on hers, because she was 7 feet 2, and her crests changed color, and people were not always sure how to act, and she was not always sure what the correct human response was to a stranger staring. She had figured it out gradually. The correct response to a stranger staring, she had determined, was the same in every species. You looked back and you didn't look away, and if possible you found something in their face that was specific enough to be curious about, and you let the curiosity show, and most of the time this converted the stare from a challenge to a question, and questions were almost always manageable. Today she was walking because she had been inside for 3 days, and the spring light was doing the thing it did, the thing she had watched from windows but not yet fully experienced, the particular angle of it in the morning that turned ordinary surfaces to something else, stone to something luminous, pavement to something almost soft. She turned a corner and nearly walked into a child. The child was small, perhaps 6 or 7 by her rough estimation of human developmental stages, and was standing with her arms out, turning in slow circles in a patch of sunlight. Her eyes were closed. She was making a small sound that was not quite singing and not quite humming, something intermediate. Marath stopped. The child opened her eyes. She looked up at Marath. Her expression went through several stages: surprise, adjustment, a period of assessment, and then settled into the particular openness of people who have not yet learned to be afraid of large things. "You're very tall," she said. "Yes," said Marath. "What are you doing?" "Walking." "I'm being the sun," the child said, with the confidence of someone whose activity requires no explanation. Marath looked at her. She looked at the patch of light. She looked at the morning. "I see," she said. She stood there for a moment, considering, and then she took a step into the patch of sunlight herself, which was larger than it looked from the outside, large enough for both of them, and she stood in it, and she could feel it, the warmth of it, the particular warmth of a star that had been burning for 5 billion years, doing what stars do, indifferently and forever. The child was not surprised by this. Children rarely were. They stood there together for a little while, the old queen and the small human, in the light of a morning that was 400 years newer than the last morning she'd seen, and Marath felt not peace exactly, because she was not built for stillness, but something adjacent to peace. The awareness that she was in the correct place at the correct time, which was a sensation she had not felt in a very long time, and which she had not expected to find here like this, on an ordinary street, in the company of a small person being the sun. Then the child ran off, because children ran, and Marath walked on, because walking was what she had. The morning continued. She continued in it. The crests along her jaw, those ancient biological signals, evolved over millennia to communicate to others of her kind, flushed warm, slow, deeply, the color she had no name for in any of the languages she had learned, the color that meant, still here, still standing, still capable of something. The world, strange and new and utterly unasked for, turned under the light of its star. She walked. She was beginning, in the tentative way that things begin which have been a long time dormant, to understand that this was enough.